Hello, everyone. Good morning on this lovely day. Thank you very much for joining, for signing up to the event. Very, very happy to have both Roger and Hugh with us this morning. Before I make a start, I'm conscious that for some of you, the software might be something that you're not used to. So I'm just going to spend about 30 seconds just to explain exactly how that software works. So I'm just going to go out of full screen mode and onto this slide here. So as you can see in front of you, if you can go into full screen mode, that will allow you to see as much of the presentation as possible. The most important reason why you're here, I suppose, is that you want to ask your questions. So you want to ask questions of Roger as leader of Kent County Council, and also of Huw Edwards, who is from Barton Wilmore. So you can ask as many questions as you like throughout the session. If this is new to you, then the way that you do that is to just click on that question mark icon there, write your questions in, and you can do that as much or as little as you like throughout this morning's event. And that is it. There are no handouts, but the one thing to say at this stage is that we do kind of want to understand what you think about this software. This is a software that we use for our public exhibitions, which is something that Curtin&Co does very regularly. So that would be great to know what your thoughts are. So at the end of the event, if you could take 20 seconds to fill in that survey, we would be very grateful. So back to this slide then. Which explains a little bit about why we are here. My name is Joseph Baum, if you don't know me already. I work for Curtin&Co. I'm also a councillor in Buckinghamshire as well. And as you should be able to see in a moment, we have Cllr Roger Gough, who is with us from Kent County Council, and we have Huw Edwards, who is here from Barton Wilmore. So a few things to know about Roger, I suppose. Roger grew up in South East London. He was first elected as a county councillor in 2005, and he's actually led the county council since October 2019. I hope this is right, Roger. He is a keen writer. As you can see, there are a few books in the background. He's written 2 books, one on communism in Hungary and one on the maltreatment of terror suspects. Obviously, let's hope that today's event will be slightly more light-hearted than that. So welcome, Roger. If you want to just say a quick hello, and then I'll go back to Hugh.
Thank you, Joseph. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And we also have Hugh. For those of you who are expecting the BBC presenter, I am sorry, but on this occasion, you will be disappointed. Initially, Hugh actually worked for Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. He then took his first step into the private sector in 1998 and joined Barton Wilmore 6 years later in 2004, where he has steadily rose through the ranks. Welcome, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Good morning, everybody.
So before I hand over to our experts this morning, I'm conscious that it's quite early. Some of you are still on your first cup of coffee, so I just thought I'd do a couple of warm-up questions to Roger and Hugh, if I may. If I could pose the same question to both of you, if you could tell us your favourite film. Let's do that. Roger?
Oh, I think it's The Third Man because it has the best line in the whole of cinema in it. It's the one about cuckoo clocks.
Okay, can't say I've heard of that one. And Hugh, what's your favourite film?
I'm afraid I'm really going to dumb down on the back of Roger's answer. There's many favourite films, but one particular was Dirty Dancing from when I was a student. I always wanted to be Johnny, the dance teacher who had rippling muscles and black leather clothes and was the very person that everybody wanted to be. I recently watched the film again with my 2 teenage daughters. I've now realised I've morphed into Dr. Houseman, the overprotective father of teenage daughters. So Yes, that's a particular favourite.
Well, let's hope that this morning's event is the time of your life, although I suspect it probably isn't. Another quick question. What did you want to be when you were 10? Roger first.
Oh, leader of Kent County Council, of course. Oddly, no. I don't know. 10 is really hard to say because I don't think I ever had the illusion I was going to be a footballer. So whatever age I was, I think I was realistic about that. I know one or two things when I was a little bit later as to what I might have wanted to be. I was quite keen actually on theatre and maybe directing and things like that. But 10, really, really hard to say. Somewhere in the middle of things then.
10 years closer to being leader of Kent County Council is good enough for our audience this morning. And Hugh, what did you want to be when you were 10? I hope it wasn't a planner.
No, I can assure you. No, it's nice and simple. An RAF fighter pilot. Nice and simple. But never clever enough or intellectual enough to pass the entrance exams.
Fantastic. And steering slightly closer to home, a final question on the spot. What is larger, the population of Kent or the population of Birmingham City?
I'll let Roger answer that one.
I think it's Kent.
Hugh?
Let's go for Kent.
You are both right. Congratulations. So the population of Birmingham is 1.2 million. Population of Kent, Roger, I won't put you on the spot on this. It's, as of 2020, 1.85 million. So it's just over on that. So thanks very much. I will now hand over to Roger, first of all, to say a few words about Kent. So over to you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Good morning, everyone, and I'll try and keep this relatively brief. I thought I'd start by saying a few things about what's distinctive about Kent and then some of the challenges that we've both faced and will face. One actually is, going back to your last question, Joseph, is size. We are the biggest county area in England in terms of population. In fact, the figure I think you cited was actually Kent and Midway combined. And of course, we have this historic and strategic position between London and the Channel ports, roads that are run up from the Channel ports to London over centuries, actually of strategic significance. The geographical split of Kent, the combination of both London hinterland and coastal periphery, a big range of social conditions is a very important part of it. The population has been rising and rising significantly. My predecessor, Paul Carter, always used to say that Kent had the biggest housing growth of any area outside central Bedfordshire. Now, whether that was correct, I don't know. But it's certainly we've been high, and we're running at the moment at around 8,000 a year, which is quite a step up, or we have been. Barring what's happened in the last year or so, but certainly in the later years of the last decade, we were on that. It is, of course, a two-tier area, plus indeed the Medway Unitary Authority. So when we meet as Kent leaders, there are 14 of us, 2 upper tier or county, a unitary, and 12 districts. I think Kent has some particular things going for it. In terms of identity, Kent is a thing. Kent is a place. It is something that people do identify with. It's geographically distinct as a sort of peninsular area. And as I say, it can operate at scale. And all those are quite important for some of the issues that we deal with as a county authority. And finally, perhaps to note that from the County Council's point of view, we confront many of the same issues that other, particularly upper tier authorities do. So the long run grind of pressure from demand-led services in social services, both adults and children. The fact that local authorities are a one-club golfer when it comes to finance, and seldom at the top of the pile in terms of government's funding priorities. So that long-run trajectory of needing to constantly find savings to be able to maintain the core services that you wish to is a feature of our life as it is of everyone else's. Just to touch on our 2020, if I may, because it was quite a year. It was my first full year as County Council leader. As you say, I took it on in October 2019. COVID clearly affected us, as it did everyone else, but in a very particular way. We were often through much of the year below the southeast or London or national averages until October, the latter part of October, when the figures suddenly took off. And of course, what we finally discovered come the week or so before Christmas was the role of the new variant. That has given us perhaps a bit of a question in terms of our image making. You've probably seen all the jolly things on Twitter with little signs saying "Welcome to Kent, twinned with Wuhan," and the like. And there is perhaps a little bit of a branding issue there. It's worth saying actually that now our rates, our COVID rates, are actually
I think we've lost you slightly there, Roger, on the microphone. Can you try again, please? Roger, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Roger? Okay, let's go to Hugh, if that's all right.
Right. I'm told audio connection restored.
Okay.
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Let's keep going with you, and then we'll move to Hugh. There must be something wrong with the internet. Always going to be the case, wasn't it? But no, if you can hear us, then carry on.
Yes, I'll carry on. Second big feature for us, of course, was Brexit, and in particular, again, what happened in the closing week or two of the year with the French government's decision to stop channel crossings. But we had actually undertaken huge preparation for that, and it may be one of the things we may wish to come up is how it is that we will confront the what happens over this coming year in that respect. So looking ahead, I think there are two or three things. One is, as a council, we have, like many other large organisations, learned to work in a somewhat different way. And the question is, how will we apply that to our estate and our services in the coming year? Second is, our location near London has always been key. And how will that influence things now when there are some signs of a number of businesses actually looking to that ring around London, moving out of London in terms of at least some of their activities? And that was something that came up very much for everyone who saw the Kent property market report late last year. That, and indeed the development of a number of key industries, particularly in the creative and life sciences sector, offer some real prospects for the county. And finally, I think one of the key areas which will be of interest, I think, to all in the audience is how does a two-tier area work in terms of managing housing demand and the constant refrain that we have from our residents that the housing comes, but the infrastructure does not. And we have been working for some time and are in the process of submitting to government what is called an infrastructure proposition, focused very much on forward funding linked to the Single Housing Infrastructure Fund, an acceleration potentially in housing, not necessarily an absolute increase, but certainly an acceleration, and balancing it across the county, particularly, but not solely, in the east. And looking to combine that with what we believe is an important strategic approach, in particular focusing on the development of a growth board of the kind that you see in Oxfordshire and Hertfordshire and indeed other places. So all of those are, I think, some of the big strands that we will see in the coming year. And I think one of the interesting questions will be how the county's own activity to reshape our estate, our activities, will play into some of those other developments that we're seeking to encourage. I could say a great deal more, but I suggest I leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Roger. I've never seen a councillor volunteer to not say any more, so that's very, very welcome. Thank you. And yeah, no, I guess lots of questions have already come through. One thing to say before I move to you is obviously we want your questions. We want to have a debate, a small debate this morning, and to start a conversation. And I think one of the things that Curtin&Co do is to facilitate a conversation between people in local government and people in the private sector, people like Hugh and people in the development and land promotion world. So without further ado, if I can pass over to Hugh. I think Hugh has prepared something for us this morning. I'm going to try and share that as well. But Hugh, if you want to take the floor, as it were, and over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Joseph. Good morning, everybody. My name's Huw Edwards, Senior Planning Partner at Barton Wilmore. Many of you will be aware that I moved our Kent operation from Kings Hill to Ebbsfleet back in 2010. And some of you will also be aware that we recently moved back to Kings Hill as we were unfortunately not able to renew our lease at Ebbsfleet. This is presently an interim move for us and something that will change across all of our 13 offices across the UK. This was brought about by the COVID restrictions and obviously the changes in working practices that we're all experiencing at the moment. Such new ways of working may be something you'd like to explore via the Q&A discussion and the potential implications this might also have on our industry. But I have also set out on the next slide a list of issues that many of us are facing that we're presently dealing with across Kent. This list is far from exhaustive, but I hope it might stimulate some of the Q&A discussion. The next slide is just setting out Kent County Council's proactive response to the present COVID situation. I do operate across many counties, and for me, Kent County Council has always been head and shoulders above other counties in the manner of their joined up approach. I'm not just saying this in a sycophantic way simply because Roger's on the call, but I've always felt this way. And for me, I think the present pandemic, together with a good dollop of Brexit, has further reinforced my thoughts in this regard. Kent County Council, Kent Developers Group, Locating Kent, they've all been at the vanguard of its and our industry's response to MHCLG and others during these uncertain times. I'd like to quickly make a special mention to Barbara Cooper, who's hanging up her boots at the end of March. She's always been a very special glue and or a channel of communication between the elected members, local planning authorities and those of us in the private sector. I think she'll be a very hard act to follow. Moving on to the next slide, which is the planning white paper. This was published last summer and I think it was largely done to death at the time. For me, I thought it was more of a vision from Dominic Cummings, largely based on several European models that do not translate easily into our present planning or political structures, let alone our legislative ones. I thought it was overambitious, with a smorgasbord of ideas, but very scant on detail, probably more akin to a green paper than a more formal white paper. But it did highlight some matters. The front loading of our local plan system. This will be a good thing if local planning authorities can be adequately resourced. The potential role of the NSIP regime as an alternative for bringing forward new settlements, another good thing. Goodbye to duty to cooperate. Double-edged sword if it's not replaced with anything to meet adjoining unmet needs. And a parallel conversation with the standard method. Again, a good thing, but more of that in a minute. But also absolutely nothing on our increasing ageing population and how the planning system could or should be responding to this ever-increasing need. But more on that in a moment as well. Moving on to Kent housing, Roger mentioned the housing issues facing the Kent. We're all now more accustomed to the standard method approach compared to that of the OAN before. This was a parallel consultation to the white paper last summer with a big political backlash, particularly from the South East Shire counties. This table shows the latest housing delivery test overview based on the most recent standard method 2 figures for Kent and Medway. This was published last week by MHCLG. This shows some very challenging annual targets for some, especially compared to what they've actually achieved over the past 5 and 10 years. But also, what does a presumption in favour actually mean for some of our greenbelt local authorities? And also, is the housing delivery test an appropriate replacement for 5-year housing land supply calculation, as was trailed in the planning white paper? Moving on to London, Roger mentioned London. We know that the December 2020 standard method 2 figures are a fudge. This was due to the aforementioned political backlash. And the fudge plays out in this table, with all the other individual local planning authority needs being directed to these 20 cities in order to still hit the overall target of 300,000 dwellings per annum. I've highlighted the London row and the already recognised unmet need that will not be provided for in London or elsewhere. Again, looking at what's been achieved in the 5 to 10 year period and the commensurate annual shortfall that's already happening. In physically adjoining London, we're only too well aware of the related economic and housing pressures brought to bear on each local planning authority in Kent. This needs a political situation. This needs a political solution. But it's a can that keeps on being kicked down the road for the last 6 or 7 years since the earlier FALT, and the same again in the soon to be adopted London plan, and also probably now in an arena with no duty to cooperate. For me, the reintroduction of regional planning and or sub-regional planning is the answer. And perhaps using the South East of England councils as a platform for this, and of course positive, proactive, supportive county councils such as that of Kent County Council. I was pleased to hear Roger talking about the Emerging Growth Board, which is exactly what we need. Moving on to the next slide, this is about the increasing ageing population. I talked about the planning white paper. There's no mention at all in the planning white paper of age-related housing, retirement housing, and the increasing ageing population. This is a recognised urgent need across Kent, projected 63% increase in the 75 plus age group over the next 20 years. It's phenomenal. County councils recognise this far more than local planning authorities do, as it's them picking up the ever increasing adult social care bill each year. And in this, it's the county council network that's leading the charge on this. I could speak for a whole hour on this point alone, but I think the important message is that it's the local planning authorities that need to respond positively. Securing specific planning policies in emerging local plans will go a long way to help meet this increasing need, but not just positively worded policies. It requires specific retirement extra care allocations, and also not just being part of just larger strategic allocations. My last slide, you'll be pleased to know, is to do with infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure, we normally talk about roads, schools, healthcare facilities, and so on. But there are also other fundamental elements of infrastructure that have significant consequences on new development and the resultant new communities. Just highlighting two here in regard to the Stodmarsh SPA, SAC, and that of phosphates. I know Roger's becoming an expert in nutrient neutrality and having high-level discussions across government and trying to help find a solution for that. I also know that Natural England is trying to help find some solutions, but again, it's the developers of new schemes that are being asked to try and solve existing problems. Kent County Council, Kent and KMET is also leading the charge, excuse the pun, on energy and low emission strategies across the county. These are two particular matters that will play an important role in us helping to achieve wider environmental objectives too, namely climate action plans and biodiversity net gain. And you may wish to discuss these and other wider infrastructure considerations too. Thank you for listening, and back to you, Joseph.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Can I pick up on your last slide as a way of starting the discussion, if I may? I noticed in The Guardian this morning, South Oxfordshire District Council residents have launched a legal challenge against the council on the grounds of infrastructure and a number of other things. So can I ask a broad question to start with, which is a question that I have. Can development ever really be compatible with environmentalism and declaring climate emergencies? Can the two objectives of building more homes and building it sustainably, can they ever really work hand in hand? Roger, can I come to you first, and then you, Hugh, please?
Yes, I mean the short answer is yes. I think they can. It's, and to some extent, given the pressures we have on population, on housing demand, we have very little option but to seek to harmonise those. I do think there are a number of elements that sustain that. It's worth, again, this goes back, I must add incidentally, I agreed entirely with, well, agreed with pretty much everything Hugh said, but particularly drawing out some of his comments about the planning white paper. And it's actually rather green, not in the environmental sense, but green paper nature. And I think one of the key elements that we felt was missing in that was recognising the importance of infrastructure, of, for example, modes of transport, and how housing development is orientated towards that. So you can have considerably more sustainable forms of development or not. So I think that there are options on that. I think there are questions around some of the infrastructure that supports that. So yes, I think the short answer is it can be done. It is not easy, and I think that's where you tie into a whole number of the issues around, what we like to call infrastructure first, as well as some very specific issues that arise. And I note Hugh made reference to the Stod Marsh issue, which doubtless we can address a little bit further. But yes, I think it can be done. I think it has to be done. But equally, I think you do have to have that wider planning framework in which to do it. Otherwise, you will not find that you build in the right ways of supporting, for instance, modes of transport that will be more sustainable than others.
And Hugh, do you think, are you clear on what the expectations are from central government and from local authorities in terms of sustainability? Have they, the clients that you work with and the local authorities that you work in, are you clear on what the expectations are, or do you think that still needs to be explained and fleshed out when you actually go about, working on these new developments?
I think it is clear, and I think that absolutely, yes, the development industry is very much alive to the environmental challenge, and I firmly believe that it's actually the new development is often the catalyst for a lot of these infrastructure improvements. The environmental standards of new development, just in the past 5 years, is increasing exponentially, and that's the challenge that's been set to us by the planning regime within which we work. There's some very challenging targets ahead regarding 2030 and 2050 in terms of climate action plans and so on. And the industry clients that I'm working with are very much engaging in that, and they're being very positive about it and not waiting to 2030 to actually implement some of the changes in their new developments, whether it's residential or commercial, in trying to help achieve those objectives.
It's interesting you talk about that in the context of development, but obviously some of the large strategic sites that you're talking about, of course, there's a lot of internalisation of trips, and that reduces the transport issues. But I suppose campaigners would say in order to create these new settlements, you're having to release a lot of greenbelt land, which probably touches on a question that we always talk about at these events, but it's probably worth asking anyway. Is it time for a national greenbelt review to properly understand what we mean by greenbelt? Hugh, I'm sure you think it's time, but how do you think government should go about actually redrawing the boundaries so that it just reduces the temperature that developers often find themselves in when they engage with communities over large strategic sites?
I think government just needs to be honest with people. The greenbelt is not an environmental designation. Greenbelt is a planning land use designation. Very often, swathes of greenbelt have no environmental interest or merit whatsoever. We are aware that those that produced the planning white paper steered well clear of the greenbelt issue in the planning white paper because it was already a smorgasbord of too many things. And politically, it was probably if it was in the planning white paper, it would have probably diverted attention from some of the sort of more fundamental elements that the government's trying to achieve through the planning white paper. But certainly a national review, including London, very much required, because at the moment with particularly London, Sadiq Khan digging his heels in about Greenbelt Review and everything else like that, some of the pressures from London are just spilling over into us Shire counties adjoining London. So yes, very, very, very much needed and very urgent.
And I'll throw that to you as well, Roger. It's a difficult question, I know, particularly given that Kent is, I think it's called the Garden of England, isn't it? So I mean, is it time for a proper Greenbelt review And I suppose an extra question that someone has asked from the audience is, how can you persuade your Conservative colleagues at a district level to accept development, particularly when there is a perception in some local authorities of, I hate to use this word, but NIMBYism? How can you have a constructive conversation with colleagues in the private sector about this particular issue?
Thanks. I think there's several things within that. I think I hasten to add, myself representing a division that is extensively green belt. I'm more conscious than most of some of the sensitivities around that. So if I don't go rushing into some very bold statement, you will entirely understand why. I think also, interestingly, and if I could just widen this a little, there is in much discussion a huge, there's the very specific issue of green belt, and then there's the attitude towards any sort of green field development. The two sometimes actually get elided, and therefore, what we actually know is very often, for a whole variety of reasons, a significant, sort of garden town type development can be one of the most sustainable outcomes that you can have. And I think many of us have seen considerable attraction in that, both in terms of building new to the new standards that Hugh mentioned, but also the opportunity to create something of critical mass and with sustainable infrastructure and support. And I think probably some of those developments may be the ways in which you can get support. It's difficult. And my colleagues, to be honest, will only ever respond, understandably, we all do this, to the political and resident imperatives that they feel that they're under. So I don't think that that's simply, if you like, a fact of life. What I think is incumbent on us, and this is why, going back to what I mentioned earlier on with the infrastructure proposition, it is trying to develop a degree of confidence publicly that this will be delivered. Now, again, I'm not trying to be unrealistic on this. People will sometimes say, we don't want the housing without infrastructure. And then if scratched, to be honest, they'll say, well, the truth is, we don't want the housing, full stop. But I do think you can actually draw some of the sting if you have developments that both are well planned and fit within and are visibly seen to have the infrastructure coming at the right sort of time. So I think you can achieve something in that. And to be fair, a fair number of councils do ultimately try to find the way through things. You will find occasions when, for instance, there'll be an officer recommendation within a housing authority and members will throw it out. That does happen. But I think we in general, and this is part of our submission against the white paper, were distinctly dubious of the proposition that it's always, in effect, the planning process, or indeed the role of members and local communities within that planning process, which is the main obstacle to development. So I think, so in brief, I think, yes, I mean, a more systematic and rational approach to the green belt, I think makes some sense. But again, I would tread very carefully on that, because it is something that has become a huge political totem, and that's why government steered clear of it in part in the white paper. And a rational approach to development planned at the right level, and with a degree of confidence amongst residents that infrastructure issues will be addressed.
And obviously, can I take this opportunity just to remind people to send through their questions using the question icon. I am trying to feed them through to Hugh and Roger as much as possible. But can I pick up on what Roger said and pass it over to you, Hugh? I mean, what do you think? I think there is an increasing recognition of the need to deliver homes. And I'm not a believer that there's actually a lot of NIMBYism. I think it's about having a honest conversation with residents and communities. But I suppose the question for you, Hugh, is from your experience and your extensive experience, what do you think is slowing down the supply of housing? Is it a resistance in communities, or is it a more fundamental problem with the system? I mean, a number of clients that I speak to, there are a number of complaints with the fact that they're allocated in a local plan, but it takes a number of years for their application to actually be processed. Do you think that's the problem, as opposed to kind of instinctive opposition from communities to change? I wonder what your thoughts are.
I think it's a raft of things. I think our planning system is far from the best, and we know that. The introduction of local plans goes back to 2004, and I think there's several local authorities that still don't have a local plan in place since that date. So there's been delay there. The lack of, I think, a big enough or a hierarchical stick, whether that's central government, whether it's a regional government or regional level, or even a county level. With localism, the introduction of localism, and each local authority being left to its own devices, bottom up, and so on and so forth, I think that's given each local authority one hell of a headache, because it's having to deal with a lot of the issues itself. So it's not perhaps surprising that some of those issues are sort of kicked down the road a bit. I think short-term political cycles don't help. Some councils have a year-on-year or one every 3 in terms of elected members. How on earth can a district council try to make longer-term strategic decisions in a political environment that's continually changing? I don't envy them at all, but I do, and so therefore I think if there were higher level, whether it's structure plans, regional plans, sub-regional plans in place, it would certainly help get that message across.
And your thoughts, Roger?
Well, I agree with that, and I think it goes back to a point that Hugh mentioned earlier, and we actually made quite a lot of in our response on the planning white paper, which is, I don't think anyone in particular will mourn the departure of the duty to cooperate in and of itself, but there is absolutely nothing put in its place. I think that's clearly, the duty to cooperate was a relatively weak form of ensuring relationships between authorities, both, if you like, horizontally, those whose housing needs spill across between one and another, but also between, certainly in a 2-tier area, upper tier authorities and district councils. So I do think that we do need, and this is why when I've spoken about our infrastructure proposition idea, it's very much around being able to take that more strategic view. Going back again, Hugh mentioned the Stodmarsh issue. That's something that cuts across a whole range of local planning authorities, makes potentially demands on both public agencies and developers, and cries out for the wider view, which, to be fair, we are taking through people like KMEP and the County Council working with our district colleagues. But yes, I think it is the absolute lack of that wider view, and I think that the system that's been built up, I do agree, in the years between 2004 and again, given a particular tilt around the turn of the last decade. So as the structure plans disappeared and when the coalition came in, there'd been talk of things that would replace them, so-called infrastructure plans. Well, nothing came of that, and the focus instead was supposedly on a bottom-up approach. And I don't think that matches what is needed, and it generates actually a great deal of ill will between all concerned, because communities feel under pressure, housing or planning authorities feel under pressure, and there is absolutely no sense that you can have coherence to what is happening to that development.
Thanks very much for that. Unless Hugh, you want to come back, I think.
No, it was just on the point of housing numbers, and we go back to 2010, the abolition of regional planning and so on, and each local authority left to its own devices regarding numbers. I think with the introduction of standard method 2, I think we're going into a new era where centralised housing figures largely being accepted by most local authorities now. When you cast your mind back to the early 2000s when we were doing the South East Plan in this area, so there was still an awful lot of debate about housing numbers, the scale of the requirement, and then the infrastructure was required to go along with it. I think there's more, just recently, there's more of a general acceptance of these new housing figures, and therefore I think that's sort of taken a lot of the heat out of what was the regional and sub-regional discussions. And I think you could now reintroduce regional, sub-regional discussions without the heat of the actual overall number, and then just collectively and collaboratively look at where it could go and the infrastructure that's required with it. And Roger's mentioned the Housing Growth Board and that Kent's leading on. It's absolutely fantastic, and that's a very, if that can go cross boundary as well into Surrey down to East Sussex, absolutely fabulous.
If I may, I'm just conscious of time, and I'm also conscious of our audience, and they're here from a variety of different disciplines. I think another key challenge, and we can obviously come back to housing, another key challenge, and Hugh, you touched on it, was the ageing population that we have, and the struggle to actually cater for that ageing population, and to do it in a way that is respectful of those people. And clearly it's a hot topic at the moment. I just want to put the question out there to both of you at this stage. How can the retirement sector gain greater support from local and national government? That is a direct question from someone in the audience. So can I ask the same question to both of you? Roger, perhaps you could go first.
Unfortunately, I lost the middle bit of the question.
How can the retirement sector gain greater support from local and national government?
I think there is actually from, and again, Hugh mentioned this, certainly if you look at the level of county councils and the county councils network, there was quite an important document put together by the county councils network and ARCO middle of last year, as I recall, which does set that out. And we at a Kent level have been working on this, and again we have, through the Kent Housing Group, a degree of coordination between the county and districts on this. So we've sought to focus very much on the needs of older people. We have had some, I don't want to overblow it, but the so-called accommodation strategy has been accompanied by an acceleration in, for example, extra care housing. I do think there may be an interesting moment on this, which is to be seized, because we, as in so many matters, COVID has accelerated something that was already happening to a degree, and the question is that acceleration then sustained? So the shift away from, for example, particularly the lower need residential solution towards focusing residential on higher levels of need, and then more in the retirement home the retirement community extra care type area. And as I say, we've been certainly seeing steps towards that in Kent. Now, I think with everything that happened in the pressures on the care home sector through this last year, it probably tilts you in that direction. So I think there is a moment to be seized, and there should be an interest, certainly between county councils and that sector, and perhaps that's reflected in the joint nature of the report by CCN and ARCO. We have a strong interest as the social care authority in what is probably a good preventative solution, and clearly the retirement home sector, retirement community sector, has a very strong interest in that as well. So I think that work is being done, and I think national government is to a degree responding to that, and it's a case of continuing to make that case, because we have a moment now when I think some structural change within that sector is taking place, and we should try to seize on it.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I mean, quite often we're working on projects where there's clearly a recognised need, and I think councillors recognise that need and communities recognise the need, and the number of people that actually support applications for retirement living on the grounds that they know someone who needs that facility, and yet they're coming up against this policy barrier, and it's almost like a computer says no, there's no need for it according to our policy. Can be quite frustrating for all involved. I mean, Hugh, do you sense that frustration, and what do you think is the answer?
Absolutely. I think education is the answer. Educating the decision makers, educating the market as well, but also educating the policymakers in the local plans. The document that Roger referred to, I'll hold it up, but I can send the link to through to you, Joseph, to share later, is absolutely essential reading in terms of understanding. This is the joint CCN and ARCO report from last year. Absolutely insightful. It's a wonderful report, and it really just sort of gets that level of understanding across. I also think Richard Osman's book, The Thursday Murder Club, that's presently being serialised on Radio 4 at the moment, that again is an education in understanding what an extra care or retirement village might be. You need to educate the elderly as well. You know, my parents don't want to go to a retirement village because they think a retirement village is a care home, and they couldn't be further from the truth. The other important thing to remember is just because somebody's over 65 or over 75, it doesn't mean they automatically want to go, or you know, they should go into a retirement village. So people still need to exercise choice. But the retirement sector product and products, there's several different products, is very, very different from a land acquisition form to that of normal C3 housing, and that needs to be rammed home as well, again with policymakers and elected members as well. It's very different, so it needs a different response.
I think it was somebody else who once said education, 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 but no, that was a very good answer. Thank you. And I think there definitely needs to be a discussion about, you know, what retirement living is and what it is, and it's actually should be a transition rather than, you know, you live in a house and then you live the end of your life somewhere else. I think there is that middle ground that a number of organisations are slowly filling that gap. Roger, do you want to come back on any of what Hugh said, or I'm happy to move on to another question that's just come through from our audience.
I think on that one we are, as I say, in violent agreement. I think within Kent we've actually made some quite decent progress in terms of the joint work between county and districts on this. But and again, in terms of the plans we have for the future, then that form of housing is a key part of what we would see as the overall increase in housing numbers that we would look to, housing trajectory we would look to for the county, so that it is an important element within it. It is worth mentioning, I think Hugh mentioned this in his opening remarks, that, as I've said, Kent overall has seen a bigger increase in its population than the national average, or indeed many of its neighbours. And within that, the increase in both over 65s and over 85s has been and continues to be also above. So this is a pretty critical issue for us.
Can I, thanks very much. Can I make a slight pivot to a different sort of question that's come through, and it's about how politicised the planning system is. So rather than talking about policy, actually moving to talking about how the decisions are made. And someone has asked an interesting question: should planning committees be made up of professional backgrounds as well as politicians? And I think probably what they're alluding to there is the sort of structure that you've got at Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. And by the way, congratulations, Simon Dudley, if you're listening. I see that you've joined the top of Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. So I guess the question is, can that work? Or should planning committees solely be made up by councillors who are accountable to their residents? I wonder what both of you think. I should probably pose that to someone first. Hugh, if we can start with you.
I was going to let Roger go first on that one, but I think councils already have that. Local authorities already have that. You know, their officers are professionals. They take professional advice. They liaise and consult with technical specialists as well. So you know, there is the degree of professionalism in the local planning authority structure already. Yes, they then take a step back from the actual decision making and sometimes have to deal with the consequences, sometimes against officer advice. But you know, that's the member prerogative. The EDC, the development corporations, work very well. I think they need to operate. They operate better on scale, on large scale and at pace. A development corporation would not be the answer for each local authority across a particular area. It might be the answer for a specific standalone development, whether that's, if you like, a new settlement or you know, the growth of not just you know, particularly large new settlement like Milton Keynes was. And then you differentiate that away from the normal, if I could put it in inverted commas, normal roles of local planning authorities outside of that new settlement proposal.
I guess, Roger, same question to you. Do you think the balance is right, or is a recommendation for approval or refusal from an officer enough, or do you think there actually needs to be kind of a House of Lords style expert representatives on that decision-making body? What do you think?
No, I mean, I am broadly relatively conservative on this one. I do think that, and again, one of the points that we raised in our response to the white paper, or even though this element of it affects our district colleagues more directly than us on most matters, was very much that what we saw as the diminution of the local democratic role within some of the white paper proposals is intensely problematic. Yes, you can always go for a more technocratic solution. The trouble is that you then increase, I think, the disenchantment that local people feel about what is then, if you like, done to them. There is, as Hugh said, there are very significant professional elements within the process. And also when councillors, there may be a question sometimes about capacity. And I think, again, this was something that came out of the debate, some of the debates around the white paper. But actually, it's always worth remembering too that councillors sitting on a planning committee still confront that issue quite often of, if you throw this out on grounds that really don't stack up, and you end up with a successful appeal, the council incurs a very, very significant loss. And there may be moments when councillors feel perhaps that local community pressure so much that they that they will be willing to take that risk. But it is actually quite a significant counterweight to them in thinking about these things. And you can, when you take these matters through in a systematic way, you can get it right with significant democratic input. I mean, one thing which we're not a planning authority for most matters, but we are in an intensely complex and tricky area like minerals and waste. Now, with highly capable officers and actually the right level of member engagement in that, you can actually take that through and come to coherent solutions in, as I say, a very difficult and what can be very contested area. So, and the same can go for local planning authorities in their responses. Now, the difficulty they may find, as I say, is and all of us may find sometimes is pressures on capacity. But I think that if you are arguing in most circumstances for taking down the local democratic accountability element of it, don't be surprised if you then have yet greater disenchantment with the entire process.
And I think it's probably worth reminding lots of people that councillors do have a lot of life experience as well. I mean, before they become councillors, some of them write books like yourself, Roger, but others come from the private sector before they go into local government. So they bring with them a lot of experience from the real world surveyors, architects, former developers. And so that's probably worth saying. But I want to pick up on what you said about capacity, because there is a very real sense in a number of local authorities that there isn't that capacity. I mean, what do you think the solution is? I pose that to both of you. I mean, some councils have decided to streamline. In Buckinghamshire, where I am, we've just gone to a unitary system. I suspect that probably wouldn't work in somewhere like Kent, where, as you can see, the geography is just so much larger, and the population, as I said, is greater than Birmingham. So, I mean, what is the solution on making that process more straightforward? Is it a question of capacity? How do we make the process not necessarily faster, but more efficient? Can I put that back to you, Roger, and then over to Hugh?
I think, well, firstly, just for the record, in Kent, we have not championed a unitary solution, and I think you would have a huge issue in an area approaching, a geographically quite large area approaching 2 million people. Then I think a unitary would be a big ask, and equally, I think the corollary of that, which is then breaking up services, some of which are best delivered at scale, if you had a series of unitaries, would also be highly problematic. So that's why we took, to go back to another big debate of last year, on the always anticipated but never delivered devolution white paper, we actually took a rather cautious stance. But I do think it's then incumbent on us to look at the ways in which the different tiers of government can pool their resources. There is good work going on between county and district through the Kent Planning Officers Group. But I think, again, one of the elements of our current proposition is around what we call an accelerator hub that intensifies that. I think that there is a question about the capacity, both in terms of how that is funded and also just the people who are out there. Is there the capacity in terms of people with the right background to be able to do the job? So I suspect there is more that needs to be done in terms of enhancing that capacity within certainly some of our authorities.
Hugh, over to you. I think, I completely echo Roger's thoughts that a single unitary for Kent would be very much the wrong answer. Sub-regional unitary authorities potentially, but I think it still needs an overarching role for the county as a whole. I think also what it needs is a good dollop of common sense when it comes to some of our infrastructure, some of our utility providers, whether it's Southern Water, conversations with Highways England, the present nonsense at the moment with Highways England to do with Lower Thames Crossing. The Highways England side of that deal with local plans use one modelling method, and then the Lower Thames Crossing part of Highways England is using a completely different modelling method, and never the twain shall meet. And so for those local planning authorities trying to put together local plans in and around the motorway where the Lower Thames Crossing is going to be is an absolute nightmare at the moment. So just some common sense and more dialogue, I think that would go an awful long way in speeding things up.
Roger, do you want to come back on anything, or there's another question I have just related to that. Do you want to jump in?
I think, to be honest, I would only add that certainly the role of national agencies in many of these issues is a constantly difficult and challenging one. And I sit on the CLEP board, and the number of times when you're working your way through a major proposal, and the question of the role of certainly Highways England, who, to be fair, when we've worked with them on something like the Brexit transition, have actually been a good partner. But the role of, I think Network Rail and Highways England, I appreciate very different sorts of agencies, but they seem to be the two that most frequently get thrown up as challenging. But it applies to a range of national agencies.
I think one of the concerns as well, coming back to how we can move that make the process more efficient is that there is a fear at the moment that the virtual meetings won't actually continue beyond May. I don't know if you've seen that, but central government, there needs to be a change in the legislation to allow those meetings those virtual meetings to continue. I don't know if you've heard that as well, but we're at 11:30. I suppose I want to give a final request for questions, but I suppose maybe this is one to end on. I suppose, Roger, why should businesses, organisations invest in Kent? I want to give you the opportunity to bang the drum for your county. So if you didn't hear that, why should people invest in Kent?
Sorry, apologies again. I'm getting a few difficulties with the reception, but I think I picked that up. So the chance to bang the drum for Kent, I think, is firstly the combination actually of location, accessibility, still in many parts of the county, in fact, across much of it, pretty decent values in terms of what you would get in terms of a return on investment. I think all make a compelling story. I think that you have a county which also has, in terms of a number of its, we've spoken earlier about the Garden of England. I sometimes talk about the Garden of England reborn, because if you look at what's happening across areas like horticulture and viticulture, the development of areas like the East Malling research and its investment plans, then I think you have some very, very compelling stories. This is a county that, as I say, has scale, has access both to London and still to the continent, a number of key areas of strength. If you look across what's happening across, say, the creative sector, across parts of the county, both along the Thames estuary and down the east coast, and then also actually into other parts less spoken of, such as parts of West Kent, or indeed areas such as the life sciences cluster that we have around Discovery Park, then there are a whole range of areas of very significant growth and development in a county which probably now, above all else, needs, and it's something we're very focused on, a little bit of rebranding, if I can put it that way, after what happened last year. And that's something which we're giving a great deal of attention to.
Thank you, Roger. Is there anything you would like to add, Hugh? Your job is not to bang the drum for Kent, I appreciate, but from your observations of the county, do you think it's uniquely placed? I mean, what are your thoughts on this particular part of the country?
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo everything Roger said, including the last point about needing a bit of rebranding, especially because of what happened towards the end of last year in the east of our county. The one thing Roger didn't mention was Locating Kent. Locating Kent is the economic inward investment arm of the county council. Gavin Cleary and his team do an absolutely phenomenal job in terms of banging that drum. And the level of engagement and support they're giving to some of our clients that are looking to invest in Kent, quite considerable sums. Locating Kent have played a fantastic role in that. So, and I go back to what I said at the very beginning, it's the combined, joined up approach across Kent. Not the county councils and the districts don't always agree, but you can always have a conversation. You can always have a conversation at the highest of levels to help find solutions to problems, pragmatic solutions to problems. So no, I'd be banging that drum as well.
If I could just add, yes, an omission on my part not to have mentioned Locating Kent, and of course one of the areas, going back to the point about rebranding, is considerable work being undertaken by Visit Kent, with whom again we, as in Locating Kent, we work with very closely to ensure that there is that effort to re-establish the county's position in the public eye after what were undoubtedly a series of significant challenges at the end of last year. But I think that is a message which we, and by we I mean all the bodies that represent Kent, are very, very focused on, and will be an important part of what we're doing through this coming year.
Thank you. And obviously, if I can just conclude by saying, as Curtin&Co, as shown this morning, we are a big believer that development, housing, but also homes, communities are at their best when people in the private sector and public sector work together, talk to each other, listen to one another, and actually have constructive conversations. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there is everything wrong with not having those conversations. So Curtin&Co are here to help, and I think both of you are here to help as well. So thank you very, very much. If I could just give a quick plug for our survey, just to find out what you think about the software, because obviously public exhibitions are a huge part of what we do, and trying to engage with the community. So if there's a way that we can make this more interactive, then please let me know. And finally, a big thank you to Roger and Hugh for your time. I will let you go back to your real jobs. And yeah, thank you very much. And I hope to see everyone in the audience.
Thank you.
Again. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.